Hey, what's up, guys? A little more Edward for you. I'm outside in my cool hammock, just getting some literacy in. So I figured might as well share with you guys. All right. So chapter 16. This is what we last left off on. Remember Edward? Edward. Kind of hard to read on a hammock. Edward was hung up like a little scarecrow. A little old lady found him after he was kicked off the train. And then this is the next one. It said the last thing that we read was, eventually the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. So this is probably the boy. Well, let's see what happens. Chapter 16. "Bryce," said the old woman, "get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare." "Yes, ma'am," said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown, with flecks of gold shining in them. "Hi," he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head, and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, "Go on, get!" And the bird spread his wings and flew away. "Bryce!" shouted the old woman. "Ma'am," said Bryce. "Get away from that rabbit. Do your work. I ain't going to say it again." "Yes, said Bryce. He wiped his hands across his nose. "I'll be back to get you," he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden. Remember this old woman, she took Edward, she found Edward, and she put Edward in her garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved. The birds circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. See, that's a good metaphor right there. The birds circled over Edward's head and laughed at him, laughing at him. Are they literally laughing? Ha 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 ha! I'm a crow laughing? No, they're cawing and they're comparing it to laughter. What was it like to have wings? Edward wondered. If he had the wings when he was tossed overboard, he could not have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up into the deep, bright blue sky. And when Lolly took him to the dump, he would have flown out of the garbage and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw, caw, caw. So Edward's seeing these birds fly, and he's jealous, and he's just kind of daydreaming about what he could have done if he could fly. In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the field. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lightened on Edward's shoulder and tapped with his beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, that not only could he not fly, he could not move on his own at all in any way. Dusk descended over the field, and then came true dark. A whippoorwill, so that's a type of bird, a whippoorwill sang out over and over again, "Whipper, whipper." It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard, and then came another song, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. "Hi," he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and played another bit of the song on his harmonica. "I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but I'm here, I am. I come to save you." Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce climbed the pole and worked at the wires that were tied around his wrist. "I am nothing but a hollow rabbit." Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. "I am only a doll made of china." But when the last nail was out, and he fell forward into Bryce's arm, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. I wonder why Edward, you're going to say it, but I wonder why Edward all of a sudden feels some joy. Why don't y'all make a prediction real quick? So he's up here. He's up on the scarecrow thing being hung up. He just feels terrible and sad. Bryce is undoing him. He still feels sad. Then suddenly he falls into this kid's arm. Suddenly, it said he feels a feeling of relief, and a feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. Why did he feel that joy? Perhaps, he thought, it was not too late after all for me to be saved. Whoa. Okay. See, I think Edward, he feels like he could never love again, right? I mean, he's already lost 3 people he loved, and he's just like, I'm done. I can't do it. I can't do it no more. And then suddenly, boom, he falls in this kid's arm, and he's like, oh man, maybe there's love out for me in this world after all. All right, that's just my opinion. Chapter 17. If you got another one, share it on the Google Doc. All right, chapter 17. We're looking at a shack. We'll see what happens. All right, guys, have a good one.